Welcome back to Consider It Life. Today I want to do something of a preview review of Matt Walsh's Am I Racist? Now I'm recording this before the actual release of the documentary, so that's the preview aspect of it. But I also want to offer an analysis of the issue where I make the claim that am I racist really isn't the most fundamental question at issue here. So I've got my Matt Walsh plaid shirt and my beard. So let's get into it. In order to sort of ground this analysis, I want to show a clip from one of the trailers for Am I Racist? And it's a little clip that is called The Moana Problem. So Matt Walsh is dialoguing with this white liberal about whether or not little girls should be able to, say, dress like Moana for Halloween.
My 3-year-old daughter her favorite princess is Moana.
Love it.
It's a good sign.
Yeah.
But then I also thought, there's a little bit of cultural appropriation here. She wants to be Moana for Halloween. Do I go and buy the Pacific Islander native attire for my white 3-year-old?
I wouldn't.
On one hand, there's cultural appropriation. On the other hand, there's gravitating towards white characters.
Right.
No matter which way you go, you end up back in racism.
So as a white guy who grew up in Iowa, I've been watching this issue of racism be discussed for years, and I was always unsettled by it. And there were certain things that bothered me about the way in which the discussion was being had. And it really is this Moana problem of sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I say that because here's another example of how that plays out in a less superficial way, in an earnest historical analysis way, in the context of college football.
In the first half of the 20th century, the social hierarchy was maintained by keeping black players out of the game. Southern football was completely segregated, and teams in the rest of the country almost never had more than 1 or 2 black players, if any at all. But just as HBCU football was finally getting its moment in the sun, the foundations of its success were about to be eroded by desegregation.
And all these great players, we kind of had to ourselves, now all of a sudden, you began to be recruiting against institutions that you really couldn't really recruit against, all these big white institutions.
By the end of the 1970s, the starters on Bear Bryant's formerly all-white Alabama team were 40% black.
By 1979, the handwriting was on the wall. It was over.
The more the previously all-white schools integrated, the less the top black players across the country were drawn to HBCUs. The era of great HBCU football was done. Since the decline of HBCUs, college football has come to be dominated by formerly all-white schools of the South. And the irony is, it's all been accomplished with players they resisted allowing in for so long.
It's going to be black labor, white wealth. We're going to take your best, your most valuable people, and put them into our institutions to make us stronger, and at the same time, make yours crumble.
So from these two clips, we have early on in the documentary this commentary that before integration, there were no black talented athletes allowed into these large, predominantly white schools. There were maybe a handful of black players here and there, but for the most part, they were excluded from the opportunities at these large schools, the opportunity for a good education, the opportunity to then go from a large, well-publicized collegiate program to the pros, right? And the consequence of that was that the pool of talented black athletes was concentrated in the HBCUs. Well, then in the 60s and 70s, once integration happened, by the end of the 70s, these schools that had been historically predominantly white were allowing significant percentages of talented black athletes into their programs to avail themselves of scholarships, of education, the ability to go into the pros afterwards, right? So the lack of integration of talented black athletes into predominantly white schools is racist. And then the disturbing commentary here is that Also, the integration of talented black athletes into predominantly white schools is also racist because of the effect that it had on diluting the talent pool of the HBCUs. So this brings us to the titular question of Matt Walsh's documentary, Am I Racist? And when I looked at that with these other things sort of in mind, I thought that is not the most fundamental question. The most fundamental question is, what is racism? What is it? Because if the consequence of the leftist narrative is that white people should feel guilty about their inherent racism, right? Guilt is a matter of moral culpability, right? I'm morally responsible for these ideas and behaviors, right? So for example, in conservative Christianity, there's a debate over whether or not homosexuality is a sin. And those who say that it is not sinful, one of their arguments is that homosexuals were born gay. If they're born gay, if this is something inherent to them that is involuntary, they didn't choose to be like this, then they're not morally capable for their homosexual behavior because it's inborn. So if that line of reasoning is correct, that whatever is inborn and involuntary lacks moral culpability, that is, I shouldn't feel guilty about being, say, white and male. The consequence of this analysis is that moral guilt follows on voluntary choice. So if I'm guilty for being a racist, then it must be that I've chosen racism, right? I have the ability to choose otherwise, but I've chosen to be racist or to adopt racist ideals. And if that's the case, the question isn't, am I racist, but what is racism? What exactly am I choosing that is ultimately immoral or condemnatory? So the truth is, we need a standard of what racism is, because not everything is racist, right? And by applying that standard consistently, we can say these things are racist and these things are not. One of the things that makes solving the problem of racism so difficult, as it's being discussed, is that there are some who positively benefit from the ambiguity. And for them, clarification of the issue is actually problematic. For these people, they have no vested interest in a clarification of the issue precisely because they benefit from its ambiguity. Besides everything we've just said, there's also this issue, just fundamental issue of adult communication. And what I mean by that is this. There's a guy I read named Danny Silk. He's written several books that have helped me personally. A Culture of Honor, Unpunishable. And Danny Silk says this, just about adult communication over issues of conflict. He says this: so many people think, if I'm in a relationship with you, then I get to tell you about you. Yet what inevitably happens when they act on this? Here, let me tell you about you. This is what you were thinking and feeling. This is what you need. These are your motives. Comments like this are inherently judgmental, presumptuous, and disrespectful, even if offered in a kind tone with the best intentions. Comments like this are judgmental, presumptuous, and disrespectful. That, I think, is part of the dynamics in the atmosphere of our culture discussing the nature of race. Okay, so do we let talented black athletes into predominantly white schools, or do we not let talented black athletes into predominantly white schools? Well, if you don't, you're racist. And if you do, you're racist. Right? That's presumptuous, it's judgmental, and it's disrespectful. To tell other people what their motives are and that those motives are only racist all the time is absurd. And that's why Walsh's documentary is so funny. It's not even really a parody. It's just reflecting the hyperbolic, judgmental preposterousness of the leftist narrative that everything is racist all the time. It lands you in these absurd situations that A is racist and not A is racist, which is contradictory. It's absurd. It's rationally absurd. But what the Danny Silk quote points out is that just in adult conversations about meaningful topics, it is judgmental, presumptuous, and disrespectful to tell the other person, I know what you're feeling, I know what you're thinking, and I know why you're thinking and feeling these things. It just is not the way to have any sort of adult conversation about any topic that matters. And yet that seems to be the tone and content of the way the left is framing the discussion at all. And the last thing I want to talk about is there is such a thing as cultivating a hypersensitivity to an issue. I remember about 10 years ago, I was speaking on a college campus and I was speaking about God and science. And there was some atheistic trend from the sciences. And I mentioned in that talk that some thesis, and I said, I call bullshit on that, referring to this card game, bullshit. And apparently the campus pastor came up to me later and said that some young woman came up and told him, I could never listen to a speaker who would use such vulgar language in public. First of all, not knowing that I was referring to a card game by the name of bullshit, but also being so hypersensitive to what she considered vulgar language that she was willing to throw out everything that I might have said that could have been clarifying or beneficial on the topics of God and science because of the utterance of this word. In my mind, that's a hypersensitivity, right? This sort of clutching at pearls, hypersensitivity to that which we believe is immoral, right? I think the same thing is going on in America with regard to race. Not every mention of a person's race is itself racist.
Angela, play black jazz.
Playing jazz.
I actually noticed this over the pandemic because I started watching PGA golf. And the PGA commentators would say things like, "Oh, Hideki Matsuyama, he's going to be hailed back in Japan because I think he's the first Japanese person to win this jacket or this title or whatever." Or they'll mention that somebody is Korean, or they'll mention that somebody is the first whatever Irish person to win this particular trophy. And it was actually refreshing to me to hear these sort of these old white commenters just talking about people's race, just in this sort of matter-of-fact way, without this overlay of this hypersensitivity of calling a Japanese person Japanese as if it's somehow offensive to mention that there are different ethnicities. So that's it. That's my flannel-wearing Matt Walsh review of Am I Racist? And the more fundamental question of what is racism? So in the comments section, tell me where I'm wrong, why I'm wrong, and ultimately why you're morally superior to me because I'm a middle-aged white guy.